The midday sun burned against the endless stretch of asphalt, waves of heat distorting the air above the road. The rhythmic sound of a wrench clicking into place echoed under the car, a sleek black Mercedes, its polished body now coated in a fine layer of desert dust. Sweat trickled down Jamal Carter's forehead as he tightened the last bolt on the new tire. His hands, rough and skilled beyond his years, worked with quiet confidence. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause. Standing beside the vehicle, Jonathan Blake, an impeccably dressed man in his 60s, watched with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. His world was one of power and transactions. Everything had a price, every favor an expectation. But here was this kid, fixing his car, expecting nothing. Jonathan opened his mouth to speak, to ask something, anything, but before he could, Jamal wiped his hands against his worn jeans and took a step back. All done? The words were simple. No pride, no boasting, just a statement of fact. Hours earlier, Jonathan Blake had been cruising down the desert highway, air conditioning blasting, drowning out the oppressive Arizona heat. The journey was supposed to be simple, a routine drive between business meetings. But fate had other plans. A sudden thud sent a jolt through the car. The steering wheel stiffened, and the vehicle veered slightly to the right. He gritted his teeth and pulled over, stepping out to find the unmistakable sight of a flat tire. Frustration flared in his chest as he reached for his phone, already dreading the inconvenience. No signal. Of course. Stranded. He was used to solutions arriving with a phone call. Assistants, chauffeurs, mechanics, people paid to handle problems. But here, alone on an empty stretch of road, there was no such luxury. He leaned against the car, exhaling sharply. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The silence of the desert was suffocating. Then, from the distance, a lone figure appeared. A young man, maybe 18 or 19, walking along the side of the road. He was lean, sun-kissed from working under the Arizona sun, his clothes faded but clean. Something about him, the purpose in his stride, the quiet confidence in his posture, made Jonathan straighten. The boy's eyes flicked to the damaged tire, then back to Jonathan. Got a flat? Jonathan hesitated, momentarily caught off guard by the directness. Yeah, and no signal either. The boy nodded, setting his backpack down. I can fix it. Jonathan arched a brow. You sure? There was no arrogance in the boy's expression, only certainty. Yeah. Without another word, he knelt beside the car, rolling up his sleeves. His hands moved with the precision of someone who had done this before. Not just once, but dozens, maybe hundreds of times. Jonathan watched in silence. Now, as the boy stood, wiping his hands, Jonathan reached instinctively into his wallet. He had expected to feel gratitude, but instead, he felt something far more unfamiliar, discomfort. He extended a few crisp bills. Here. I appreciate the help. Jamal glanced at the money, just for a second. Then he shook his head. No thanks. Jonathan frowned. Take it. I don't need it. The boy offered a small, unbothered shrug. Just happy to help. And with that, he turned, picking up his backpack and continuing down the road as if nothing had happened. Jonathan stood frozen, the money still in his hand. This was new. This was different. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. As he got back into his car and pulled onto the road, his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. He checked the rearview mirror, watching as the boy's figure grew smaller, then disappeared entirely. But the encounter wouldn't leave him. Long after he had driven away, the boy remained in his thoughts. And Jonathan knew this wasn't over. Jonathan sat in his dimly lit study, a glass of scotch untouched on the desk beside him. The city skyline stretched beyond a massive windows, lights flickering against the darkened sky, yet his mind was elsewhere. He had met thousands of people in his life, business partners, employees, rivals, but never had an interaction unsettled him quite like this. A kid, barely out of his teens, had fixed his car, refused payment, and walked away without another word. It was such a small moment, yet it refused to leave his mind. He could still see the boy's hands, moving effortlessly, his quiet confidence, the way he had wiped his palms against his jeans like it was just another day. Jonathan had been ready to forget the whole thing, to chalk it up to a rare encounter with someone who simply didn't care about money. But that wasn't what bothered him. What unsettled him most was how the boy had made him feel small, insignificant, like he was the one who had been given something, rather than the other way around. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. It didn't make sense. He had built his empire from the ground up, made a name for himself in the world of luxury cars and high-stakes business. He had spent decades ensuring he was never at the mercy of anyone, never in debt to anyone. Yet a stranger had helped him, expected nothing in return, and left him feeling like the one who owed something. The thought gnawed at him long into the night. He told himself to let it go. It was just a flat tire, just a boy with a toolkit and a good heart. But it wasn't that simple. He needed to understand. He needed to know who the kid was, where he came from, and why he had walked away from money like it meant nothing. The next morning, Jonathan found himself behind the wheel of his car, retracing his route from the day before. The desert stretched endlessly on either side of the road, the sun already scorching the pavement, but he barely noticed. He drove past the spot where his car had broken down, slowing slightly, as if expecting the boy to reappear. But of course, he was gone. At the next gas station, he pulled in and approached the counter. The cashier, an older man with weathered skin and tired eyes, barely looked up as Jonathan slid a bill onto the counter and asked if he had seen a young man, about 18 or 19, walking along the road the day before. The man frowned, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. Kid wearing an old blue shirt, couple of patches on his jeans? Jonathan nodded, his pulse quickening. Yeah, I've seen him around. Helps people out sometimes. Works over at the garage in town when they need an extra set of hands. Name's Jamal, I think. Jamal. Finally, something concrete. Jonathan thanked the man and left, driving toward town. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he felt a strange pull, a need to see the kid again. Not just to thank him, but to understand why this was bothering him so much. The town was small, a collection of modest houses, a few businesses, and a diner with a faded sign. He parked near the garage the cashier had mentioned and stepped inside. The scent of oil and rubber filled the air, the sound of tools clinking against metal echoing through the open space. A man in grease-streaked overalls glanced up from beneath a lifted hood. Help you? Jonathan hesitated. He wasn't sure how to phrase it without sounding ridiculous. He cleared his throat. I'm looking for a kid named Jamal. I heard he works here sometimes. The mechanic wiped his hands on a rag, nodding toward the far side of the shop. He's out back. Jonathan walked through the garage, stepping outside into the glaring sunlight. There, leaning against a rusted old truck, was Jamal. He was wiping oil off his hands, his expression unreadable as he looked up. You again, Jamal said, not unkindly, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who wasn't used to being sought out. Jonathan studied him for a moment, unsure of how to begin. I didn't get a chance to thank you properly yesterday. Jamal shrugged. Nothing to thank me for. You needed help. Helped. It was such a simple statement, but it carried weight. Jonathan had spent a lifetime in negotiations, where even gratitude had strings attached. He had never met someone who spoke so plainly, without expectation. You could have taken the money, Jonathan said. Jamal smiled, just a flicker of amusement before it faded. Yeah, but I didn't need it. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Most people would have. Jamal tilted his head slightly. Maybe most people aren't used to having enough. Jonathan wasn't sure if that was meant as a jab at his wealth, but he let it slide. He had come here to satisfy his curiosity, but now that he was standing in front of the boy, he felt something else entirely. A kind of admiration he wasn't ready to admit. You work here. Sometimes. Mostly odd jobs. Cars, fences, anything that needs fixing. You good at it? Jamal shrugged again, but there was no false modesty. I know my way around an engine. Jonathan hesitated before speaking. You ever think about doing more with it? A real job, real training. Jamal's expression hardened slightly, just a flicker. People like me don't always get chances like that. Jonathan felt a strange tug in his chest at the words. It wasn't self-pity, wasn't bitterness. It was just the truth as Jamal saw it. You could. Jamal studied him carefully. You offering something. Jonathan hadn't planned on it. He had come here just to understand, to satisfy some nagging part of his conscience. But now, standing in front of this kid who had more integrity than half the people Jonathan had done business with, he realized he wanted to do more than just thank him. I might be. Jamal wiped his hands on his jeans again, the same way he had the day before. I don't take handouts. Jonathan nodded. Good. I don't give them. For the first time, Jamal looked genuinely interested. Jonathan didn't know what had brought him here today, what exactly he was trying to prove to himself. But as he looked at the young man in front of him, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the last time they'd speak. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt like he was about to do something that actually mattered. Jonathan sat in his car outside the small auto shop, fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. He hadn't expected to still be here. When he set out that morning, the plan had been simple. Find the kid, say his thanks, and move on with his life. But something about their brief exchange had made it impossible to walk away. There was an undeniable honesty in Jamal's demeanor, a quiet strength that made Jonathan question things he hadn't thought about in years. He had spent his life in a world where every handshake had an agenda, where success was measured by how much you could take from a deal. Yet this kid, standing there in an oil-stained t-shirt, had walked away from money like it meant nothing. That wasn't just rare. It was unheard of. The engine hummed as he considered leaving, but the thought unsettled him. He had come all this way. And for the first time in years, Jonathan had the strange feeling that he wasn't in control of the situation. He had built an empire out of understanding people, knowing what drove them, what they feared, what they wanted. But Jamal was an enigma. Finally, he stepped out of the car and walked back toward the shop. The mechanic he'd spoken to earlier barely looked up from under the hood of a car. Jonathan nodded in his direction, but kept moving, heading straight for the back lot where he'd last seen Jamal. The kid was still there, now crouched next to an old pickup, checking something beneath the wheel well. His hands were steady, precise. Even from a distance, Jonathan could see the ease with which he worked. This wasn't just something Jamal did for money. This was something he understood, something he was good at. You planning to stand there all day? Jamal's voice broke the silence without him even looking up. Jonathan smirked, stepping closer. Didn't want to interrupt the artist at work. Jamal exhaled a quiet laugh but didn't respond. Instead, he finished whatever adjustment he was making and stood, wiping his hands on the rag tucked into his pocket. You always come back for people who help you with a flat tire? Jonathan crossed his arms. No. Jamal studied him for a moment, then leaned against the truck. So what is it? Jonathan hesitated. He had spent his life crafting the perfect answers, always knowing exactly what to say in boardrooms and negotiations. But now, faced with a kid who had no interest in playing games, he wasn't sure how to explain himself. I don't know, he admitted finally. Jamal didn't look surprised. He just nodded, as if the answer made perfect sense. That's honest. Jonathan had the unsettling realization that he wasn't used to being read so easily. People usually worked to impress him, to gain something from him. But Jamal didn't seem to care about any of that. He was listening, but not in the way people usually listen to Jonathan, with calculation, with anticipation. He was just listening. You any good at this? Jonathan asked, nodding toward the pickup. Jamal raised an eyebrow. You watched me change your tire. What do you think? Jonathan chuckled. Fair point. The brief moment of levity faded, replaced by something heavier. Jonathan had spent years around cars, but only from the business side. He knew numbers, he knew investments, but he didn't know the machines. Not like Jamal did. You ever think about doing more with it? Jonathan asked. Jamal tilted his head. More. Yeah. Real training. Real work. Not just side jobs here and there. Jamal exhaled, shaking his head slightly. People like me don't always get that kind of shot. Jonathan frowned. People like you? Jamal shrugged, but there was something guarded in his expression now. People who didn't grow up with connections. People who don't have a safety net. Guys who work jobs like this, not because they're stepping stones, but because they don't have anywhere else to go. Jonathan leaned against the truck beside him, arms crossed. He wasn't sure when the conversation had turned into something so weighty, but he wasn't about to back away from it. That's a load of crap. Jamal snorted. Is it? Yeah. You're talented. I could see that in 5 minutes. Talent gets noticed. If you're good, you can go anywhere. Jamal's jaw tightened slightly. It's not that simple. Jonathan considered that. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe the world wasn't as black and white as he had once believed. But he also knew that opportunity only came to those who were given a door to walk through. Let's say it could be that simple, Jonathan said. Let's say someone gave you a shot. Would you take it? Jamal didn't answer right away. He was studying Jonathan now, and for the first time there was something different in his expression. A hint of curiosity, maybe even hope, quickly masked by skepticism. What kind of shot? Jonathan hadn't planned this. He hadn't come here with any intention beyond understanding why this kid had left such an impression on him. But now that he was standing here, seeing the way Jamal held himself, the way he had instinctively dismissed the idea of a future beyond side jobs and quick fixes, he realized he wanted to do something about it. My company owns an auto shop in LA, Jonathan said. It's high-end. Good people. Good training. If you want it, I can get you a spot there. Jamal exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head. That's insane. Jonathan shrugged. Maybe, but it's real. Jamal didn't respond right away. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly as if considering the weight of the offer. I don't take handouts. Good, Jonathan said. I don't give them. Silence stretched between them. The distant sound of cars on the main road, the hum of the air conditioning unit on the shop's roof, the occasional clang of metal from inside. It all faded into the background as they stood there, neither one willing to be the first to back down. Finally, Jamal exhaled. I don't know. Jonathan nodded. Think about it. Jamal studied him one last time, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I will. Jonathan pushed himself off the truck, stepping back toward his car. As he reached the driver's side door, he glanced back. This isn't charity, Jamal, he said. It's a job. A real one. Jamal didn't look at him, but Jonathan saw the way his jaw tightened, saw the way his fingers curled slightly against the fabric of his jeans. He was considering it. And for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was about to do something that actually mattered. Jamal lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom. The fan overhead spun lazily, pushing warm air around the room, but it did little to cool his thoughts. His mind kept circling back to the conversation with Jonathan. A job? A real one. It should have been easy to dismiss. Rich men made empty promises all the time. They threw around opportunities like spare change, never expecting anyone to take them seriously. But Jonathan hadn't spoken like someone offering charity. He had been direct, almost businesslike, as if he had already decided Jamal belonged in that world, whether Jamal believed it or not. That was what unsettled him the most. He had spent his whole life being told what he couldn't do, what he couldn't have. College wasn't in the cards, not with bills to pay and a mother who worked double shifts just to keep them afloat. People like him didn't get chances like this. And yet, here it was, sitting in front of him like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. The next morning, he went about his usual routine, helping his mother with breakfast, fixing a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, heading to the garage for another day of work. He tried to push the offer out of his mind to convince himself it didn't matter. But it did. Jonathan had planted a seed of doubt, a tiny fracture in the foundation of what Jamal had always believed about his own future. It sat there, waiting, demanding to be acknowledged. By noon, he was restless. The garage was slow that day, only a couple of minor repairs coming in, and he found himself staring out toward the road, half expecting to see Jonathan's car pull up again. But the Mercedes never came. Instead, his mother called him home early, her voice tinged with something he couldn't quite place. When he arrived, he found her sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She didn't look upset, but there was something measured about the way she studied him. You met someone yesterday, she said, not a question, but a statement. Jamal stiffened. He had learned long ago that his mother saw more than she let on. Yeah, he admitted. Some guy helped on the road. She nodded slowly. Jonathan Blake. Jamal frowned. How do you? He came by. His stomach tightened. What? He wanted to talk to me. Said he offered you a job in Los Angeles. Jamal exhaled, running a hand over his face. He didn't like this. He didn't like that Jonathan had gone around him, spoken to his mother before he'd even made a decision. What did he say? His mother tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. He said he saw something in you. Said he doesn't do this often. Jamal scoffed. Yeah, right. Her gaze didn't waver. I think he was telling the truth. That threw him off balance. He expected her to be skeptical, to warn him against trusting a man like Jonathan. Instead, she sounded thoughtful, almost hopeful. I don't like him going behind my back, Jamal muttered. His mother took a slow sip of coffee. I think he knew you wouldn't listen to him. Thought maybe you'd listen to me. Jamal tensed. He hated that she was right. She set the cup down gently. Why are you fighting this? He hesitated, searching for the right words. It's too easy. Nothing comes that easy. His mother's eyes softened. Baby, when has anything ever been easy for you? That hit harder than he expected. He looked away, jaw tightening. You've worked for everything you have, she continued. You've done things the right way. Maybe, just this once, something is supposed to be easy. Jamal shook his head. It's not about easy. It's about, I don't know. What if it's not real? What if I get there and it's just another dead end? His mother leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. And what if it's not? Jamal swallowed hard. He had spent so much of his life preparing for disappointment that he had never really considered the alternative. She reached across the table, taking his hand. You're afraid to want more, because wanting means you could lose it. But you deserve more, Jamal. You've always deserved more. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then quietly, she said, You should go. Jamal exhaled slowly. He didn't know if she was right. He didn't know if any of this was real. Jonathan Blake was the kind of man who actually followed through. But he knew one thing. If he walked away from this without even trying, he would regret it for the rest of his life. That night, he packed a bag. And the next morning, as the sun crept over the horizon, he got on a bus to Los Angeles. The bus rumbled along the highway, the steady hum of the engine filling the silence. Jamal sat by the window, watching as the Arizona desert blurred into endless stretches of road. He wasn't sure what he expected to feel, excitement, maybe, or nerves. Instead, there was only a quiet unease, a weight in his chest that refused to settle. This was real now. No more debating, no more running through scenarios in his head. He had made a decision, and the reality of it pressed against him like a tight grip around his ribs. His mother had hugged him before he left, her embrace steady and warm. She hadn't cried, though he knew she wanted to. She had simply held him, whispered, Make the most of this and let him go. Now, as the miles stretched between him and everything he had ever known, he found himself wondering if he had made a mistake. LA was a different world. He had seen it in movies, on TV, the city of money, power, and people who never looked back. He wasn't sure where he fit into that picture. Jonathan Blake wasn't just offering him a job. He was offering a door to a world Jamal had never stepped into, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. By the time the bus pulled into the station, the sun had settled low in the sky, casting the city in a golden haze. Everything felt bigger here, louder, faster. People moved with purpose, their expressions unreadable, their steps quick and deliberate. Jamal stepped onto the pavement, duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and inhaled deeply. The air was different, thicker, tinged with car exhaust and something almost electric, like the whole city was vibrating just beneath the surface. Jonathan had told him to call when he arrived, but Jamal hesitated. He didn't want to seem desperate, like he needed the man to hold his hand through this. Instead, he found a bench, dropped his bag, and sat for a moment, grounding himself. A few feet away, a man in a worn jacket paced near the entrance, talking loudly into his phone. A woman sat at the edge of the sidewalk, her suitcase beside her, tapping idly on her screen. No one looked at him. No one cared who he was or where he had come from. That should have made him feel invisible. Instead, it felt like freedom. He pulled out his phone, stared at Jonathan's number for a long moment, then pressed call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. You're here. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Jamal said, shifting slightly. Just got in. A pause then. Where are you? Bus station. Downtown, I think. I'll send a car. Jamal frowned. I can take the train or something. Jamal. Jonathan's voice was patient, but firm. Let me send a car. Jamal hesitated, then exhaled. All right. Give me 20 minutes. The line clicked off and Jamal sat back, watching the city move around him. He didn't want to be handled. He didn't want to feel like someone's project. But Jonathan didn't talk to him like a man giving charity. He He spoke like someone who expected results. 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Jamal stood, adjusting his bag, and approached cautiously as the driver, a man in a crisp suit, stepped out. Jamal Carter. He nodded. Mr. Blake sent me. Come on in. The door opened smoothly, revealing a pristine interior, all leather and quiet luxury. Jamal slid inside, resisting the urge to fidget as the car pulled away from the curb. Los Angeles unfurled before him. Towering buildings, streets packed with cars, neon lights flickering against the glass. Everything moved fast, like the city itself was impatient. He felt out of place. Not in the way he had back home, where his future had always felt like a straight line, predictable and unmoving. Here, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like anything could happen. 15 minutes later, the car turned onto a quiet street, pulling into a gated building that looked more like a hotel than an apartment complex. As the door opened, Jamal stepped out, glancing up. Jonathan was already waiting for him at the entrance. The man was dressed in his usual effortless style, pressed slacks, tailored jacket, the kind of clothes that made it clear he belonged here. He studied Jamal for a moment, then nodded slightly. Long trip. Jamal shrugged. Not bad. Jonathan gestured toward the building. Come on. You'll stay here for now. Jamal followed him inside, his footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The lobby smelled of something expensive, leather and faint cologne, like money had a scent. Jonathan led him to an elevator, then up to the 5th floor. When the doors slid open, they stepped into a quiet hallway lined with sleek doors. Jonathan stopped in front of one and handed Jamal a keycard. This is yours for now. Furnished. Everything's set up. You start at the shop tomorrow. Jamal glanced at the card, then at Jonathan. Just like that. Jonathan met his gaze evenly. Just like that. Jamal exhaled, gripping the key a little tighter. He wasn't used to things being easy, and maybe that was what scared him the most. Jamal stood in the doorway of his temporary apartment, the keycard still clenched in his hand. The air inside was cool, the lights automatically flicking on as he stepped over the threshold. The space was modern and minimal, sleek furniture, dark hardwood floors, and windows stretching from floor to ceiling, revealing a glittering skyline beyond. It felt more like a luxury hotel than a place meant for someone like him. He dropped his duffel bag onto the pristine couch, scanning the space with quiet unease. A kitchen with stainless steel appliances, a bedroom with crisp white sheets, a bathroom that looked untouched. Everything about this place screamed temporary, like it wasn't meant to be lived in, only occupied for a brief time before someone else took over. Jamal had never lived anywhere like this. Back home, their apartment had always felt lived in, even when things were tight. The scent of his mother's cooking clung to the walls. Worn furniture carried years of memories, and every inch of space had a purpose. Here, in this carefully curated apartment, there was no history, no sign that anyone had ever existed here before him. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the polished floor. His mind felt too full, but also strangely empty, like he had left something behind on that bus and hadn't quite figured out what. It wasn't doubt. Not exactly. He knew why he had come here. The opportunity was real. He had seen it in Jonathan's eyes, in the way the man spoke, like this was something he had already decided was happening, whether Jamal believed it or not. But belief was harder. The weight of everything, his home, his mother, the way things had always been, it all pressed against his ribs, making it difficult to breathe. This city wasn't his. Not yet. A soft chime broke through his thoughts, the vibration of his phone rattling against the glass coffee table. He picked it up, expecting to see his mother's name, but instead, the screen flashed, Jonathan Blake. He considered letting it go to voicemail, but something stopped him. He answered. You settle in? Jonathan's voice was even, the same steady tone he always used. Jamal glanced around the apartment, the untouched surfaces, the impersonal decor. Yeah, a pause. Then you eat yet? Jamal frowned slightly. Not hungry. Another silence, this one longer. Then Jonathan said, be at the shop at 7. Don't be late. The call ended before Jamal could respond. He let out a slow breath, setting the phone back down. Tomorrow. It wasn't that he was afraid of work. He had been working since he was a kid, fixing things for neighbors, helping out at the garage. But this was different. This was expected of him, not just something he had fallen into out of necessity. He wasn't sure what that meant yet. By the time morning arrived, he had barely slept. The city was already awake by the time he stepped outside, the air thick with heat even this early. The car Jonathan had sent before was gone. This time, he was on his own. He found the nearest train station, buying a ticket and squeezing into a packed subway car, the scent of coffee and city life pressing in on all sides. LA moved fast. It wasn't like home, where people took their time, where faces were familiar, and you could predict the rhythm of the day. Here, it was different. People didn't look at each other. They were focused, determined, moving towards something unseen. He wondered if he would ever feel that kind of certainty. The shop was a 15-minute walk from the station. When he arrived, it was nothing like the garage back home. This wasn't some rundown place with cracked pavement and a tin roof. It was sleek, professional. The cars parked outside weren't beat-up trucks or old sedans. They were expensive, high-performance machines that probably cost more than his entire neighborhood. Jamal hesitated just outside the glass entrance, watching as mechanics moved inside, working with precision, their uniforms crisp and clean. This wasn't some side job. This was the real deal. He forced himself to step inside. The scent of motor oil and metal filled the air, but everything was controlled, organized. A reception desk sat at the front, and behind it, a row of service bays where cars were lifted, tools clicking rhythmically as mechanics worked. A voice cut through the hum of the shop. "You, Carter." Jamal turned to see a tall man, late 50s, built like he had spent his entire life lifting engines. His face was lined, skin tanned from years of working outside, but his sharp blue eyes were assessing. "Yeah," Jamal said. The man nodded once. "Joe Carver. I run this place." Jamal had heard the name before. Jonathan had mentioned him. A former racer turned mechanic, someone who didn't tolerate nonsense. Joe looked him over, taking in the worn sneakers, the backpack slung over one shoulder. "You ever work on high-end cars before?" Jamal straightened slightly. "I know my way around an engine." Joe grunted. "We'll see about that." He turned, motioning for Jamal to follow. They walked through the shop, passing cars that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Jamal recognized some of the models: Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Aston Martins. Cars he had only ever seen in magazines or through windows he wasn't allowed to step past. Joe stopped beside one of the service bays, where a silver Porsche sat lifted on a hydraulic platform. He crossed his arms. "Tell me what's wrong with it." Jamal frowned slightly. "You want me to?" "Figure it out," Joe said, nodding toward the car. "Show me what you know." Jamal hesitated for half a second, then stepped closer, running a hand lightly over the polished frame. He crouched near the front wheel, studying the angle, the slight tilt of the car's balance. He noticed it almost immediately. "The suspension's off," he said. "Front right side is sitting lower than the left. Could be a shock issue, but it's more likely a control arm problem." Joe didn't react. Jamal stood, moving to the rear, checking the alignment, running through possibilities in his head. "Feels like there's weight pulling too much toward the left," he muttered to himself. If it was just the suspension, the shift wouldn't be this noticeable. Probably something in the steering rack, too. Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Joe grunted. "Not bad." He motioned toward the car lift. "Get started." Jamal blinked. "What?" Joe raised an eyebrow. "You want to work here?" "Then work." Jamal swallowed, but he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the tools nearby, his fingers already moving before his brain could catch up. The doubt, the unease, it faded. Because this, at least, he knew how to do. Jamal worked in silence, his hands steady as he loosened bolts and inspected the undercarriage. The tension he felt moments ago melted away as he focused on the machine in front of him. He wasn't thinking about where he was, who was watching, or what this job meant for his future. He was just working, just fixing. It was familiar. Comfortable. The one thing in his life that had ever made sense. Joe stood nearby, arms crossed, his sharp blue eyes following every move. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer unnecessary guidance. He was watching, evaluating, but Jamal could feel the subtle weight of expectation in the air. He traced his fingers along the control arm, feeling for wear, checking for play in the joints. The problem wasn't just in the suspension. The rack was loose, the alignment off. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but if someone drove the car too hard, it would be. Jamal sat back on his heels. Steering rack's compromised, he said, voice even. Control arm's not the main issue. Whoever was driving this thing was probably pushing too hard on turns. If we don't fix it now, it's going to start pulling at high speeds. Joe grunted, nodding slightly. You sound confident. Jamal wiped his hands on a rag. Because I'm right. For a second, Joe's mouth twitched like he was holding back a smirk. He turned, grabbing a clipboard from the nearby workbench, and scribbled something down. Then he nodded toward the car. Finish it. Jamal didn't argue. He went back to work, falling into the rhythm of it, the clink of tools, the scent of oil and rubber filling the air. Other mechanics moved around him, some glancing his way, but no one said anything. He could feel the curiosity, the quiet judgment, but none of it mattered. By the time he tightened the last bolt, wiped the grease from his fingers, and stood, Joe was already waiting. Jamal exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Done. Joe didn't check his work immediately. Instead, he studied Jamal, like he was seeing something beyond just his mechanical skill. You're rough around the edges, Joe finally said. But you know what you're doing. Jamal met his gaze. Yeah. Joe nodded once. Then, with no further ceremony, he handed Jamal a keycard. Lockers in the back. Uniforms inside. You start full-time tomorrow. Jamal took the card, fingers closing around it. He had expected a test, a process, something longer. He hadn't expected this. Joe must have seen the flicker of surprise in his expression because he added, Blake doesn't hand out favors. You're not here because he likes you. You're here because he thinks you're worth something. Prove him right. Jamal swallowed, nodding. I will. Joe grunted. Good. Now get out of my shop. Jamal didn't argue. He changed in the locker room, slipping out of his grease-stained clothes and into a fresh uniform. The fabric was stiff, new, unfamiliar. The name patch over his chest read Carter. It felt strange, real. When he stepped outside, the sun had already dipped below the skyline, casting the city in hues of deep gold and purple. The heat of the day had cooled, but the air was still thick, humming with energy. Jonathan was waiting by the curb, leaning against his car. He was watching the street, hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. Jamal stopped beside him. You don't have to keep checking up on me. Jonathan smirked, glancing his way. I wasn't. Jamal huffed a quiet laugh. Right? Jonathan pushed off the car, tilting his head toward the sidewalk. Come on, let's eat. Jamal hesitated. I'm not hungry. Jonathan cut in. I don't believe you. Jamal rolled his eyes, but he followed anyway. They ended up at a small place, tucked between high-rises, the kind of restaurant that didn't try to impress anyone but had the best food anyway. The kind of place Jamal wouldn't have stepped into on his own. They sat in a booth near the back, the hum of conversation around them blending into a low background noise. Jonathan studied Jamal for a moment before speaking. Joe says you did good today. Jamal shrugged. I know my way around a car. Jonathan nodded. Yeah, you do. Silence settled between them for a beat. Then Jonathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You're not here because I want to fix your life, Jamal, he said. You're here because I see something in you. You remind me of someone I used to be. Jamal frowned slightly. You were never in my position. Jonathan smirked. No. But I remember being young and knowing I could do more if someone would just give me the damn chance. Jamal didn't look away. And someone gave it to you? Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah. Jamal thought about that. He wasn't sure what it meant yet, what he was supposed to do with it. But something about it settled in his chest, taking root. Jonathan leaned back. So what do you think? Jamal raised a brow. About what? Jonathan smirked. About what comes next. Jamal exhaled, considering. He didn't know everything yet. He didn't know if this city would ever feel like home, if this job would be enough, if he would always feel like an outsider looking in. But he knew one thing. He was here. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. He was moving forward. And that, for now, was enough.